Okay, let's go ahead and start. We're going to be taking a look at the skeletal system today. The lab test opened up today, by the way, and it's open until the 18th of September. It is probably 50 questions, multiple choice, and you've got 10 days to take it, and the test runs, you can have, it's only 50 questions, it will last for an hour on there. If you have any issues with eLearn, let me know. I can probably fix most things in eLearn. If it dies on you, I'll see if it died. Let me know it died. If eLearn died, the test locked up, I can always reset that. Don't worry about it. So try not to wait to the last minute to take it, because if you end up with a problem, then it's, I can extend it if I have to, but I really don't want to. If we don't have to extend it, I really like, just try and get it done on time. But if it's a good excuse, if it's a reasonable excuse, I will. So anyway, if you have any questions on anything, shoot me an email. I can try to give you a more thoughtful answer if I have time to think about it. I will, we're going to go ahead and get started here. We're going to take a look today at the human skull. This is all found in the content section of eLearn. All of these slides, by the way, that you're seeing here in the PowerPoints, every one of those came from the lab CD. You may have seen an email about the lab CD being available to you to download. Well, there's a lot of material in that lab CD that we don't use. And so I've extracted out all the content that is relevant to our labs and place that in eLearn for you, so you don't have to think about downloading what we used to call the old lab CD. So anyway, you're not missing out on anything. So let me go ahead and share our screen and go into the skull. There we go. So just a reminder that we have 206 bones in the body. We have 206 bones, and probably well over that number, all the different articulations where bones come together, and all the little processes of openings and ridges and bumps and grooves and flat areas and spines and points and things like that in here, and all the terminology that goes with it. So there's a lot of information here. This is just, this little cartoon here is just to show you that a lot of the bone, the bones are in the arms and legs and the hands and feet and fingers and toes. Most of them have the same names. So a lot of what you're going to learn is going to be the same in the left side of the body as it is in the right side of the body. We've got 12 ribs on each side. They don't all have, none of them have different names. They're all ribs. We have, our shoulder blades are called scapulas. We only have 2 of those, same in the left and same in the right. So just remember that while it may sound overwhelming here, it really isn't like that. What I will tell you is the best way to prepare for this bone test is to excuse me, is to learn a few bones at a time. If you wait to the very last minute to take your test and you prepare for it one day ahead of time, you're not going to do well. You have to know these bones, and it will take you several weeks to get ready for this test. But you'll never forget these bones, because this is one of the things that we do particularly in lab, it has some real relevance. Learning all these bones has a great deal of relevance in what you're going to do in healthcare. Your ability to know what these bones are and where they're located. whether it's radiology or nursing or physical therapy or surg tech, knowing your way around the bone structure of the body is very important. And so we try to cover all, as many of the bones as possible. We cover all 206, and we try to cover as many of the openings and joints and cavities and grooves and things that are necessary here. So the way I recommend to study for this test, prepare for this test, is to learn a few bones each night. For example, tonight, if you're not going to be, if you want to take a break from preparing for your first lab test, look at the skull and learn 5 bones. Memorize 5 bones. Very simple, the easiest bone to remember is called the frontal bone. I'll show you that here in a second. Learn 5 bones. Tomorrow night, add another bone to it. And then the next night, add another bone to that, another bone to that. And pretty soon you have the entire skull memorized. And then you can move on to other bones, other structures in the body. And gradually over 3 or 4 weeks, you'll have the whole thing memorized. Okay, so reminder, there are 206 bones in the body. 202 of those are found in the skull. That's not counting the openings for nerves and blood vessels and auditory nerves and muscle attachments, things like that, which we all have to know those too. Anyway, there are 206 bones in the body. 22 of them are in the skull. The skull fits together like a puzzle. In fact, we have a skull in Morristown, in Sevierville, that if we were on the ground, I can get it out. It's called the exploded skull, and it shows all the pieces separated. And it really is a puzzle. Try to put that thing back together again. Now, this is a CT of the skull. And what it does is it shows you, it's showing one thing, there's a big dark spot on here. And that shows you something's going on here. But this shows you all the bones of the skull. It shows you the bones of the cervical vertebrae, the first 12 vertebrae of the spinal column. It shows you the edges of the clavicles, right? There's bones that are sticking out right there are the clavicles, and it gives you some of the ribs, and it also shows you the edges of the shoulder blades. There's one there, you can see it as we go around. So, and there's some big dark spot there on the side of the head, side of the skull. You have to wonder about what's going on there. But anyway, this is how everything fits together. The number one bone that everybody gets right on the bone test is the frontal bone. The frontal bone is the big bone in the front of your skull. It is right behind the skin and muscle of your forehead. It's here in the front. It extends all the way down to halfway down the area called your eye orbit, where your eyeballs are located, and extends about halfway back across the top of your head. This bone, very powerful, very strong bone to protect the brain inside here. The muscles on top of this allow us to show expression. The muscle, there's a very thin muscle on top of the bone. And directly underneath the skin, you can feel your skull if you rub your forehead very easily. So you know the muscle layer there is very, very thin. That muscle layer there allows you to show expressive actions. It doesn't do a whole lot else for us. But the bone there in the front, called the frontal bone, muscle, by the way, is called the frontalis. So there is a bone. There's the first bone you'll need to learn, and it's also the first muscle that you need to learn, the frontalis and the frontal bone. It's a large bone, protects the front of the brain. It also gives shape to our face. Everybody's face is distinctive, and the shape is partially dictated by the size and shape of the frontal bone here. Now, looking at our skull, and these are not real skulls, these are models, life-size models, by the way. If we were in class, you'd get to play with these things. This round structure here, this opening is called the eye orbit. It's where the eyeballs go, obviously. Now, within the eye orbit, there are several openings in there, but also there are some openings above and below the eye orbit. Here we have a mark here called the supraorbital notch. It's the bone appears to be notched there, a little chunk missing. Supra always means above. So one of the first terms we learn here is supra. Supra is above. Supraorbital means above the eyeball socket, the eye socket. Supraorbital, above the orbital. Now, in most things in anatomy, if you have a supra, you're going to have an inferior to go with it, because supra means superior. There will be some variation on inferior to go along with that. In this case, we have the infraorbital foramen. Infra means below the orbit. In this case, it means below. It means below the orbit. Now, foramen is a Latin term that means opening. They could have said opening. They could have said hole. They could have said tube. They could have said whatever. But it is the infraorbital foramen. The term foramen means an opening, and we use this a number of times here. It's not the only word that we use for an opening, but it's probably used more often than others. So we have the infraorbital foramen, the opening below the orbit. Now, both the supraorbital notch and the infraorbital foramen are the location of passage of nerves and blood vessels through the bone, either going to or from the skin or going into the brain, whatever they're there for. So we have these openings. That's what foramens do. Passage of blood vessels, passage of nerves, or both. So supraorbital notch, infraorbital foramen, and the eye orbit. Now, another opening. This is in the orbit itself. This is known as the optic foramen. It's also called the optic canal. The optic nerve leaves the eyeball and goes to the brain through that opening. So the optic foramen, optic canal, optic passageway, optic tunnel. Usually optic foramen or optic canal is where what we see here. The optic nerve leaves the eyeball and goes into the brain through that structure right there inside the base, inside the back of the orbit itself. Now, just forward of the optic foramen is another bone called the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone plays a real big role here in the skull structure. The ethmoid bone extends from the inside of this orbit to the inside of the other orbit here. It extends down to the base of the nasal cavity here and extends up into the skull. So it's a fairly large bone. It serves as a passageway for olfactory nerves to go up into the brain. That means nerves that are responsible for detecting odors. It also divides the nasal cavity in half to help create turbulence. Turbulence in the nasal cavity allows air that's being breathed in to become warmed up, cleaned up, because the air is passed against all the mucus that's inside the nasal cavity, and all the dust and dirt and particles and bacteria and pathogens get stuck in that mucus. And it allows the air that's coming in to be moistened. So we have warm, wet, clean air to breathe. There's our frontal bone right there in the front where it belongs. On either side of the frontal bone, right behind, right at the midline, the frontal bone extends back to the midline of the skull. And on either side of the midline, there are two bones called the parietal bones. And conveniently, the names, the lobes of the brain underneath have the same name: parietal lobe, frontal lobe. We have another bone over here called the There we go. That's the temporal bone right there on the side where our ear canal comes in. If you look at, there's an opening here for our ear canal going into the brain. That's the temporal bone. You stick your fingers in your ear, you are in the you're in the region of the temporal bone. In front of the temporal bone, in front of the parietal bone, below the frontal bone is a bone here called the sphenoid. It's on the side. It's right behind the orbit, and just below the frontal bone. That's called the sphenoid bone, and it's also deceptively large. It extends from side to side. It goes all the way from one side of the skull to the other. It forms the base of the skull. The base of the brain often will rest on the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone will also protect the base of the brain. It extends all the way across and forms a lot of the floor of the skull in here for the brain. It also extends down almost to the area behind our upper jaw, the maxilla. This is the maxilla. So this sphenoid bone covers an area inside the brain that's quite large. It's also called the Batman bone because it's shaped like a bat wing, shaped like a bat, if you will. So it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine it looking like, the Batman symbol. Okay, moving on. This bone right here is called the zygomatic bone. It forms the outside portion of your eye orbit. It's also what we call our cheekbone. It gives our face part of its shape and characteristic. The zygomatic bone is variable in size depending on male or female, depending on racial makeup too. Different racial makeups have different bone structures because of the shape of the bone is dependent on what kind of genes they have or have inherited. So different people have different faces. The zygomatic bone reflects that. And again, forming on your typical skull, it forms forms the bottom part of the orbit and the cheekbone. And we can tell this is all the skulls these are models of skulls, all the skulls that are made as models. Most are male skulls. And so male skull shows sort of a rectangular shape here for the eye orbit. A female skull would have more of a rounded shape here, and the zygomatic bone would be less thick than this is. Again, it all has to do with the genetic makeup of the individual. Get underneath the skin, get underneath the bone, and everything's the same. Other than that, it doesn't matter what it looks like on the outside. Okay. The maxilla is the upper jaw. The maxilla doesn't move. Maxilla has 32 teeth in there, and we have 16 teeth in the upper jaw. 16, whatever. The number of teeth in the upper jaw match the number of teeth in the lower jaw, and the lower jaw does all the work in moving back and forth to chew, 16 in the upper. 16 in the upper, 16 in the lower, 32 altogether. This is the mandible down here. The lower jaw is the mandible. The mandible does the work. It's pulled up by a series of muscles to chew against, to grind the teeth against the teeth in the maxilla. Maxilla never has to move. The mandible, on the other hand, is pulled upwards by these muscles on the side. And so that's how we chew. We pull the mandible up, We grind or rip or tear while we're eating with our teeth. And we have specialized teeth to grind, rip, or tear. This structure here in the middle of our lower jaw is called the mandibular symphysis. The symphysis is an area where two bones come together and meet in the middle. Now, in some areas, like what we call the pubic symphysis, we'll see that next week, where the two pubic bones come together at our pelvis. there's a pad of cartilage there. We call it the pubic symphysis. That functions as a shock absorber. In other cases, the bone grew together. We have this joining at the mandibular symphysis. You see, when we are in utero, we have a complete skeleton in place 6 weeks after conception. We're an inch long. We have a complete skeleton. We've had a heart for 3 weeks, and the heart's been beating for 3 weeks. We have a complete skeleton at 6 weeks, made out of cartilage. The cartilage and membranes. The bones at the top of the skull are all made out of membranes, but they are the template, the model, if you will, to become filled with calcium and harden and turn into bone. And as the lower jaw, as the mandible, we follow the model of the cartilage. Gradually, all that cartilage converts to bone and works towards the middle, and it becomes one fused bone. The area where they came together is called the mandibular symphysis. This is the mandibular angle where the bone bends and goes up. And then we have the mandibular ramus, the portion of the mandible that moves up to articulate against the base of the skull. Articulate means that bones rub together. They come together and they form a joint where they come together. And so when we say bone articulates in the socket, for example, it means it's rubbing in that socket. It's in contact with that socket and moving. That's what articulation means. Okay. Now, we've already mentioned the temporal bone, and I've talked about the opening to the ear. There's your opening to the ear canal right there. The auditory nerve will go through here, but this is something else. Obviously, this shows you this is the parietal bone here, and there's the frontal bone there. There's your sphenoid bone right there. There's your zygomatic. There's your mandible and your maxilla, and there's you can even see the ethmoid right here. This is the temporal bone, one of the bones of the skull. This little pointy thing here, coming off of the temporal bone, is known as the styloid process. It's a pointy thing. It's called a styloid process because early anatomists said it looked just like a stylus. Now, we use a stylus now to mark on our tablets, to mark on our electronics, to mark on our screens. It's a pen that really doesn't function as a pen. It's just, it's a pointy, when I got one here, and it's like a plastic pointy stick, so I can mark on the screen. Well, that's what 400 years ago, an anatomy, or probably even longer than that, a stylus was a device used to mark on a clay tablet to write in, probably 1,000 years ago, even longer. So the term stylus was a pointy stick that you used to write with. Well, the term stuck. Anatomists said any sharp, pointy object in the body was a stylus, or the styloid process. We have 2 of them in the skull. We have 2 of them in each lower arm, one on a bone called the ulna, the other on a bone called the radius. So we have at least 6 locations in our bodies where we have these little pointy structures called the styloid process. What are they there for? They are a really good place to attach muscles. Anytime we have a structure called a process, that's a common term. Process rank, we talk about fontanelles. Now we have a process. A process is an extension of a bone. And in most cases, that process is where we're going to attach something, usually muscles. When in doubt, it's a process. So, styloid process, a pointy structure that sticks out. Here we see this, there's the styloid process right there, for real, on this skull, one on both sides. Now this squiggly line here is called a suture. When we are developing in utero, and I said that we had a hyaline cartilage skeleton, that was true except for the bones at the top of the skull were membranes. And those membranes grew together. And when they grew together, they formed, the area where they were growing together was called a suture. And when it calcified, it became rigid and immovable. And a suture line is really a joint where the bones have formed together. And this is called the coronal suture, because remember a coronal plane divides you into front and back, or anterior and posterior. Coronal suture separates the skull into the front half and the back half. And it is an immovable joint. It formed while we were in utero. It probably took years for it to become solid and immovable, because we haven't talked about it yet, but in our bodies, our bones are not fully calcified until we're about 23 years old. So it takes a very long time for our bones, our skeletal structure, to be completely in place. And so the coronal sutures were probably one of the last things to go. You see, the skull had to be able to expand as the brain grew. So we had these membranous bones here that were sort of squishy, with these sort of squishy sutures in between here, these joints. And so we had a little bit of give to the shape of the skull as we grew and our brain got bigger, as our head got bigger. So that's the coronal suture line. There's the frontal bone. There's the parietal bone. There's the temporal bone. There's our zygomatic bone, our cheekbone. This is a new one back here. This is the occipital bone, a very large bone. It goes all the way from about halfway back, halfway down the back of the skull, and extends all the way up just about to the maxilla, the upper jaw. It provides an opening for the passage of the spinal cord going up into the brain. Very large opening in here too. This suture line is called the squamous suture. It's on the side. We have the coronal suture, the squamous suture. This one in the back here between the parietal bone and the occipital bone is called the lambdoid suture. Here in the front, we have the nasal bone. Nasal bone only extends down about halfway. The rest of our nose, the lower portion of our nose, is made of cartilage. It has great flexibility. Nasal bone is only the top half of the of our nose, because the nose would extend down from here further on down, further out, because only the top half is bone, the rest is cartilage. Here we have, now let me back up. I was going to say, pick out another one. This bone here is called the mastoid process. You can feel your mastoid process. If you reach behind your ear, you'll feel a bump right behind your ear, on the inside portion of your ear, behind your ear actually. That's the mastoid process. Mastoid process is part of the occipital bone. It is very spongy, it's very porous. It becomes a passageway for sound to go through your bone into the inner ear. It's frequently a location for cochlear implants for people that have hearing impairments, because you can bypass if the inner ear isn't functioning and the auditory nerve is, you can bypass all that and go straight to the auditory nerve or to the inner ear through a cochlear implant. And usually that's implanted in the mastoid bone. The mastoid process extends down here about an inch or so. You can feel it here. You're only feeling a portion of it. And it's a very important structure as far as the ability to rotate our heads too. We'll see in muscles that the ability to turn our head to the left or to the right involves two very powerful muscles that attach here and pull on that structure, pulling our head to the right or to the left. Okay, there's one of the styloid processes there. There's our ethmoid bone. Directly in front of the ethmoid bone is the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone contains the opening for the lacrimal gland, which releases mucus and tears to wash our eyes off, that wash the dust and debris off of our eyes. This little opening here, if you said it's a foramen, you'd be correct. If you said it was the mandibular foramen, you would make what we call an honest mistake here. It's called the mental foramen. There is a mandibular foramen, but it's on the inside of the mandible. This area, for whatever reason, is called the mental area. And there's a foramen on both sides of the mandible on the outside surface. Again, a passageway for blood vessels and nerves, but they're called the mental foramens. Now here's our occipital bone I mentioned earlier. You only got just a taste of how big it is, but it goes from about halfway down the back of the skull and wraps itself around underneath here and comes up right to the area just behind the maxilla, the upper jaw. There's a large opening right there called the Foramen Magnum. Foramen Magnum means big opening or big hole. You know, foramen is opening and magnum means large. So large opening, large hole, big hole works. You know, you want to remember it that way. And that's where the spinal cord goes up in and joins the brainstem going into the brain. There's the occipital bone, you know, where it's not moving around on you. You know, it gives the back of our head its shape. It protects the occipital lobe of the brain. That's what these bones do. They protect, you know, these bones, occipital, parietal, temporal, and frontal, protect the lobes directly underneath them. Frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe. The occipital lobe in particular is our vision center. So while we collect light rays with our eyeballs, the interpretation of what we're seeing takes place in the back of the brain. And of course, it also lets the brainstem, the spinal cord join with the brainstem. It helps hold the brain up. Okay, I said there was a mandibular foramen on the inside of the mandible, and there it is, one on each side. There and there. That is those are the mandibular foramens. The mental foramens are on the external surface of the mandible. Mandibular foramens are internal. Don't know why. Don't know why they're named like that, but they are. So another suture. You know, I've shown you the coronal suture and the lambdoid suture and the squamous suture. Here is a sagittal suture. It runs down the middle of the skull. It separates the two parietal bones in half. We have frontal bone here, parietal bone on the left, parietal bone on the right. And they join to the coronal suture in the front. There is no frontal suture in an adult skull. So just another one of this very important, very noticeable suture. Very, very noticeable. Just like the coronal suture is a very noticeable suture. And of course, here we see how long the sagittal suture is. Right there. There is the coronal suture. There is the lambdoid suture back here. There is no frontal suture up here, but this very big sagittal parietal bone, frontal bone. Parietal, occipital. This is the other parietal bone right here. Coronal suture, sagittal suture, lambdoid suture. The sphenoidal suture is on the side, on each side. Okay, now I mentioned this earlier, the sphenoid bone, the bone that is often called the Batman bone or the bat symbol bone or the bat bone or whatever. It runs from side to side or extends from side to side. The sphenoid bone is present here, right behind the zygomatic bone and just below the frontal bone. And the sphenoid bone extends all the way across to the other side. So you have two sphenoid bones on one on either side, but that's just one of part of a very large bone that forms the base of the cranial cavity itself. Because you can see how big it is here. It extends down to just behind the maxilla. So they are the underside, they are the bottom portion. The sphenoid bone is the bottom portion of the cranium. The ethmoid bone, remember the ethmoid bone on either side of the eye orbit, it extends. It shows up on each eye orbit on the medial surface of the eye orbit, and it goes up into the to the base of the brain, and extends, comes down to the nasal cavity. The sphenoid bone is the one that is shaped like a bat. You look at this and imagine this is the ethmoid bone here, part of the this is part of the ethmoid bone here, not part of the sphenoid bone. Is this one here? And if you imagine that these are the wings, the entire thing looks like a bat, or maybe you just think this portion looks like a bat. Either way, it's the bat bone or the Batman bone. This shows the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone extends from side to side. This is the lesser wing of the sphenoid, this area right in here, we have a little pointy area and the curve. This is the greater wing down here, and the greater wing is, if you look at it, do you imagine that the whole thing looks like a bat, or only a portion of it looks like a bat? Does this upper portion here look like the bat? Doesn't matter. We just say the sphenoid bone looks like a bat, or it looks like the Batman bone. It's just an easy way to remember it. Okay. This is the lesser wing of the sphenoid, lesser because it's smaller. And in anatomy, if you have lesser anything, you're going to have greater to go along with it. If there's a lesser, there's going to be a greater. If you have a superior, you're going to have an inferior, or a super, you'll have an infra. If you have an external, you're going to have an internal. If you have a medial, you're going to have a lateral. That's just the way anatomy goes. Okay, this is the lesser wing of the sphenoid. This bigger one is the greater wing of the sphenoid. It has to do with size, not position. This opening here is the jugular foramen. The jugular foramen is the passageway for the jugular vein. Jugular vein comes down from the brain, passes through these foramens, goes down and joins with the great vessels that are leading into the heart. It is the primary means of draining the brain area. So we have a jugular foramen there and one over here. This large opening here is the Foramen Magnum, means big hole or big opening or large opening, or however you want to remember it. This area right here where the 63 is written, this is known as the Cela Turcica. The Cela Turcica is part of the sphenoid bone. It's also the location of the pituitary gland, the master gland of the human body. Releases 8 different hormones, and it's about the size of a pea, about the size and shape of a pea. It sits inside the Cela Turcica, where it is thoroughly protected by bone on, on all but 2 sides. You're heavily protected in the front and the back, and then side-to-side protection is because it doesn't move. Cela Turcica is Latin for Turk's saddle. Apparently, the shape of the bone looks like a saddle, and so early anatomist named it Cela Turcica, Turk saddle. You'll see it when we have some imagery here that shows what it looks like from the side. That's the location of the pituitary gland, one of the most protected portions of our brain. Now these openings here, there's 4 of them in a row. They are called the foramen ovales. The outside ones are the foramen ovale. The inside ones are the foramen lacerum. These are for the passage of cranial nerves going into and out of the brain. How do you remember what they are? Well, there's only 2 words to remember, ovale and lacerum. Now, how do you remember which one's which? Well, ovale is on the outside, on both sides, on all 4 of them. The outside openings are the ovales, and the lacerums are inside. And you can think O-L-L-O. That's the order of these openings. Foramen ovale, foramen lacerum, foramen lacerum, foramen ovale, O-L-L-O. Ovale is on the outside. O for outside, O for ovale. Another image of the jugular foramen. Again, you can see it right there. And the other one's over here, because we have paired jugular veins, one on each side. Here we have a tiny little opening that we see here called the Hypoglossal Canal. The Hypoglossal Canal is the passageway for one of the cranial nerves. There's only 12 cranial nerves. And the Hypoglossal Canal comes through that opening and goes from the medulla oblongata, one of our major reflex centers in our brainstem, to the tongue in our mouth. The hypoglossal nerve controls our ability to swallow. It's a reflex center. Swallowing is a reflex. And so the hypoglossal canal is the passageway for the hypoglossal nerve. That nerve controls our ability to speak, to swallow, to eat, to communicate. Damage to that nerve or damage to the medulla oblongata makes it difficult for your patient to speak or to eat or to make noises at all. So, and that little tiny opening there for the hypoglossal canal, it shows that little tiny nerve goes through there, on both sides. Very, very important nerve, because it's the nerve that controls our ability to swallow and indirectly to speak and to chew and everything else, because it controls the movement of our tongue. Okay, this is an angled view right here, looking down into the skull. Let me go back a couple slides here and show you. Okay, if we're looking at this image right here, we're looking straight down into the skull. But if we were to tilt the skull about 45 degrees forward, we would expose the area underneath the lesser wing in here, and we'd also give a better view of these 2 openings here. And that's what we're going to see here on this angled picture. We're looking at this from an angle. Now this is still the Cela Turcica here. Now you can see this section right in here is the back portion of the posterior portion of the Cela Turcica, the back of the saddle, if you will, because the groove that is where the pituitary gland sits is in this space behind this little wall here. You can't see the foramen ovale or lacerum ovale because they are hidden by this line of bone here. They're down in this gap in here on both sides. Now this opening here and this opening here are the optic foramens or optic canal. This is where the optic nerve comes through. The same optic nerve that you saw. This is the optic foramen. You see the other side of the optic foramen that you saw when you looked into the eye orbit. it's coming out here just in front of, excuse me, just in front of the Cela Turcica. As this is the Cela Turcica here, there's the opening there, and there's another opening there. You also see openings here for another cranial nerve. This opening here is called the foramen rotundum. Passage of another optic nerve. This ridge of bone here on both sides contains the auditory nerve coming in from the inner ear, going to the brain. The inner ear is all the way just inside, just inside the skull, and the auditory nerve travels all the way here, and it pops out into the brain through this opening here and this opening here. We call that opening the internal acoustic or auditory meatus. So the auditory nerve comes in from both ears, one from each side through those openings. It travels through this ridge line here and here. That ridge line is called the petrous portion of the temporal bone. It protects the auditory nerve as it gets into the brain. Back a couple pictures here. See what it looks like. There is the petrous portion right there and there. Out here on either side is going to be where the ear canal ends and the internal ear starts. And we see the opening for the internal acoustic or auditory meatus here and here. We also see there's the the optic foramen there. There's the foramen rotundum. Notice how only the ovalles show up here and here. There's the Cela Turcica. And this also gives you another good view of the shape of the bone. It's like it's almost like you take a pencil, lay the pencil in there. It would fit inside that little groove. Okay. Okay, the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone forms a structure in the base of the skull that's perforated. See, our olfactory receptors line the inside of our nasal cavity, and the olfactory nerves go up into the brain. Now, we have lots and lots and lots of little branches of that olfactory nerve. The olfactory bulb receives those signals in the brain. You have to get them up to the brain to be able. You can't smell. We can't pick up any sensation until we get it to the brain. Because we have hundreds of little branches of the olfactory nerve, they can pass up through these perforations in the ethmoid bone to get to the olfactory bulb. And this perforated bone is called the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate. So the olfactory nerve branches come up from the nasal cavity up through that bone into the brain. Oops, the wrong way. Now another structure, part of the ethmoid bone, is something called the crista galli. Now the crista galli rises up out of the middle of the cribriform plate. It has nothing to do with smell. It has everything to do with holding the brain stationary. Since the brain is squishy and it can't support its own weight, the brain sits inside of a triple sac of connective tissue called the meninges. And inside the meninges, the brain floats in salt water called cerebrospinal fluid. It circulates through the brain, down through the spinal cord, back up again. So the brain can float because it can't support its own weight. You took a fresh brain out of a head and laid it down on an examining table, it would just sort of ooze apart. To hold the brain together and to keep it from getting damaged inside the skull, the brain is held inside the sac of meninges suspended in salt water. The meninges are attached to the crista galli, so the brain doesn't move around. Even though it's a snug fit, it can still slosh around. We don't want that to happen. So we have these meninges. I mean, the brain is squishy, it can slide across and slam against the side of the skull in response to blunt force trauma. We don't want that to happen. So we hold the brain in place with the meninges. And the meninges attach at the crista galli. Here we see, this is the cribriform plate. You just see the perforations there for the olfactory nerve branches. The olfactory bulbs are going to be located on the base of the brain here and here. And then 58 is the crista galli, the cribriform plate, all part of the ethmoid bone here. Now, if we look at the posterior surface of the skull, we can see those ovale, lacerum, lacerum ovale. Here we can see the foramen magnum. We also see a new opening called the carotid canal. Now, the carotid arteries go up through that canal into the brain to supply the brain with blood. They're some of the largest arteries and most powerful arteries in the body, sending lots of blood up to the brain. The return flow is under very low pressure and then comes back through the jugular foramens. The jugular foramens are right here, directly below the carotid canals. And so there and there. Now this flat area here gives us a new word too. This is called the mandibular fossa. Fossa means flat area. The mandibular fossa is where the angle of the mandible will articulate against that flat bone. So because our jaw has to move up and down when we chew and while we speak. And so it articulates in that flat area there, minimizing friction, held in place by muscles, and it gives us that motion, that angular motion that we need. This bone here is called the vomer in the front. This bone extends all the way through the nasal cavity, dividing it in half. This is the nasal cavity here and here. And in the front, that bone is called the ethmoid bone. So we have the vomer and the ethmoid dividing the nasal cavity in half. This bone here is the palatine bone. It forms the beginning of the roof of our mouth. It also forms the base of the nasal cavity, or part of the base of the nasal cavity. Because here we see the rest of it. This is the palatine process of the maxilla. There's the palatine bone right here. And the palatine process extends into the maxilla. And you can feel the roof of your mouth. You can feel your palatine process. You stick your finger in your mouth and press upwards the roof of your mouth. That's the base of the nasal cavity. It's also the hard palate roof of our mouth, dividing the nasal cavity and oral cavity into two separate areas. And the palatine process is an extension of the palatine bone. Of course, there's the vomer again here in the back. Foramen Magnum again. Styloid process, mastoid process, and here are another term, condyles, occipital condyles. Condyles are projections. A condyle is a projection that goes vertically, up and down. If it's an epicondyle, it goes side to side, left and right. The occipital condyles are the structures that the skull uses to sit on top of the first vertebrae in the spinal column with. So we have these projections that extend up and down right here. And they're on either side of the foramen magnum. And just at the base of the styloid process is another opening for a nerve called the stylomastoid foramen, because it's right next to the styloid process. Here we have in the front the ethmoid bone. This is the perpendicular portion of the ethmoid bone. Here we have a structure in the middle between the eyes called the glabella. The glabella is all that's left over of the membranes that grew together to form the frontal bone from both sides. That's all we have left is the glabella. It's a little ridge-like structure here. Because the frontal bone in the adult skull is one bone, but during our fetal development, it was two separate structures. It started out as two membranes growing together, and then it became the frontal bones, which became the frontal bone and did not leave a suture line. Here is the external acoustic or auditory mediators there. That's where the auditory nerve enters the petrous portion of the temporal bone and extends until it comes out on the internal auditory mediatus or internal acoustic mediatus. Again, if you have an external anything, you're going to have an internal anything. This is the fetal skull. Not real, it's a model. But here we see a number of structures. Frontal suture, which we don't have now. This is when our frontal bones were membranes and being calcified. They grew together and formed one bone. All that's left is the glabella, which is located right here as an indicator that that's what happened. There's the frontal suture. These became one frontal bone. This is the soft spot, also known as the anterior fontanelle. It takes a long time for that soft spot to calcify. It gives flexibility to the skull so that when the brain enlarges, the skull can help to enlarge with it. It is the largest of the fontanelles that we'll see here. And if you've got an anterior anything, you have to have a posterior something to go with it. So there's the anterior fontanelle. We often refer to it as the soft spot. Frontal bones, which ended up becoming a frontal bone. Parietal bones, stayed parietal bones. They have the sagittal suture down the middle. Here we can see the coronal suture, that remained. The frontal bone is separated from the parietals through the sagittal suture and through the coronal suture. Parietal bone, frontal bone, temporal bone, coronal suture right there. Sagittal suture runs down the middle. This is a fontanelle here and another one here. This is called the sphenoidal fontanelle. This is called the mastoid fontanelle back here. And there's our anterior fontanelle. The frontal suture, which goes away. The coronal suture, which remains. And the sagittal suture, which remains. Looking at the back of the skull, again, the sagittal suture, parietal bone, lambdoid suture, and right there, this little tiny structure is your posterior fontanelle. Like I said, if you have an anterior, you're going to have a posterior. So the sagittal suture, the lambdoid suture, the coronal suture all remain. They all remain, but we lose the frontal suture and the fontanelles all disappear. Occipital bone there. And that is the skull. And that's where I want to stop right now. So how do you prepare for this? Well, pick 5 bones in the skull. You know, maybe the bones in the front, maybe the bones that cover the lobes. Learn 5 of those, and tomorrow night add a 6th one to it. The next night add another one to that, another one to that. Pretty soon you got all the bones learned. Maybe do 10, whatever you feel comfortable doing. And then from there, you know, you go into the bones of the axial skeleton, and then into the appendicular skeleton. We've got plenty of time to get ready, but you need to work a little bit every day. Because This is something you can't wait to the last minute to get ready for. So, anybody have any questions? Okay, I'm going to get us out of here, and I'll see you all later. So have a good rest of the day. And this will get posted later on this afternoon.